Our beautiful 2004 Mercedes SL55 has got an oil leak. It has had for some time, and today I'm going to fix that. So Auto Classico have very kindly lent me a ramp today, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the oil pan, the actual pan itself, the gasket, and also the seals for the electrical conductor and plug that goes to the conductor plate. First thing we're going to do is just take off this front plastic sheathing here, and then we'll take off the rear one. These are just 8mm bolts. You see how rusty they are. Now this car has only spent about 3 days of its life out of a garage, but what happens is when it's cold you get moisture condensing on all the steel parts and they rust. There are 4 bolts holding this first pan on. When you take the last bolt off, make sure the whole thing doesn't fall on your head. And just make a note of how that comes out. Once you've taken that first pan off, the second one is held on by an additional 6 8mm. There's 2 here, 2 at the back, and then these 2 at the front here, 1 here, and then 1 on the other side here. But just bear in mind, if you do have an oil leak, when you take this pan here off, you may find that it's full of oil, so just be careful that you don't end up pouring oil all over yourself. Once you've got that last bolt out, this should just come down. As I say, it may be full of oil. No, we're okay. Now it's quite possible to lose 1 litre to 1.5 litres of transmission fluid in this car before you even know it. And what you'll see is just this pan here will fill up with oil, and it won't start dripping on your garage floor until you drive off. There's a little clip missing there. So if you're having problems with your transmission, you're stuck in second, or you're going into neutral and the transmission's doing strange things, the very first thing to do is actually check the transmission fluid level. Now the next thing we're going to do is take off this bracket here, which just supports one of those pans. Depending on how much you want to burn your hand, you can either do that with a standard socket, or it's much easier to get an extension so you're not touching the hot exhaust pipe. Now the fittings that hold that bracket on are not nuts. They are fittings like this, and what you're going to need is a deep 8mm socket to get those off. Don't be tempted to try and get that off with a standard socket. What you'll end up doing is rounding the nut or the fitting and then making your life really difficult. Now whilst I love living in England, I don't love the climate so much. Just look at the state of some of those fixtures there. Once you've got that bracket off, the next thing to do is to get the transmission pan bracket off. Now that's a 13mm socket there, but the sockets that we brought with us are actually slightly too thick to get in there, so you're going to need a narrow one. There's nothing special about these bolts, they're just 13mm flanged bolts. Now these transmissions normally leak for one of 3 reasons. Either the rubber gasket here is leaking, possibly the sump plug can leak, and also the electrical conductor here can leak. It has 2 oil O-rings on it, and once those O-rings go, you start getting oil wicking up the electrical cable and causing all sorts of problems. Now we are, as I mentioned, going to actually be replacing the whole sump pan here, and I've already got the gasket on, and the reason for doing that is just the last time I was underneath this car I noticed that this had started to rust. You can get these sump pans here from Euro parts. They're not particularly expensive. They come pre-installed with the plug here and also the magnet. So if you find that when you take your sump off, it's either twisted, and sometimes these will twist, and that's why you get the leak around the gasket, or you find that you've stripped out this fitting here, you can actually get a new sump if you need to. Now if you're going to be replacing the conductor plate as well, you're going to need to take this plate off here and undo the electrical fitting there. Now that fitting is held on by a 7mm nut, I believe, and there's a little catch to undo it. Before we start loosening the clamps for the transmission pan, we're going to undo the drain plug and let the oil out. Now that is a 5mm standard Allen key, but it is absolutely crucial that you clear out that hole first and make sure that the Allen key is properly seated before you try and undo that. Do not want to strip that thread, otherwise you will end up buying a new transmission sump. This feels remarkably tight, this. Like I'm gonna snap that. That sump plug. Oh! Look at that. If you had the strength of Mr. Mike Mercer, you've probably done a few of those. before, haven't you? Yeah, that is tight. I'm actually going to use my own oil catch pan because it's really easy to pour oil from here, and I need to measure how much oil is actually going to come out. So if I've lined this up correctly, she doesn't look too bad, that oil. Now, when the oil goes in, it is obviously red, and one of the things that might catch you out about an oil leak and not realizing it's a transmission oil leak is that oil, as you can see, is now a beautiful brown color. Now, if you're sensible, what you can do when you undo the drain pan bolts, because there'll still be a good load of oil in there, is you undo the end ones first and leave these in loose so the pan will tilt down, and that will cause some of the oil in that pan to continue to run out the drain plug hole. One thing that's worth mentioning is the torque spec on the drain plug sump bolt should be 20 Newton meters. The torque spec on these Torx fittings here is 8 Newton meters. When you come to undo them, they'll feel like they're very light, but these are not designed to be over tightened. If you over tighten these, you're likely to kink the transmission pan seal, and that's one of the reasons those seals leak. So just remember, when you're putting these back on, 8 Newton meters, and obviously in a crisscross pattern. Once you've cracked these bolts, you should be able to just undo them by hand, and just make a note when you take these off of where the clamps go and how they clamp the oil pan. You can see that once you've taken the front 4 bolts out, if you loosen these, you'll get an awful lot more oil coming out, and that will save you having an oil bath. The other thing that will potentially save you having an oil bath is putting the sump plug back in before you take this off, and using this as a catch pan to catch the remaining oil. Just while we're waiting for that oil to drain, the transmission takes about 7 litres of oil. I'll try and look at the exact figure when I get back, and you're only going to get about 3 to 3.5 litres of oil out of the sump pan, and by undoing this here. If you wanted to do a complete transmission oil replacement, you'd have to get involved in the torque converter. I'm just going to put the sump plug back in now, and take these remaining 2 bolts out, and hopefully do it carefully so that I can pour the remaining oil in here, because you're going to want to know how much oil has come out of the transmission sump so that you know how much to put back in. Here's the remaining oil in that pan, and we're going to carefully pour that into our catch pan here. Now, this is the oil filter here, and when you take that out, once again, you're going to get a whole load of additional oil coming out, and this will carry on dripping for quite some time. And if you wanted to get the maximum amount of oil out of your car, you'd leave this to drip overnight, but unfortunately we don't have that luxury. You can see here that this fitting on this side is actually slightly different from the other fittings. When you come to take the oil filter out, it just pulls straight down, but before you pull it out, my advice would be to tilt it forward like that, because you'll have a whole load of oil running out of the bottom of the oil filter when you tilt it down, and that will avoid you getting oil all over yourself and the garage floor. Next up, we're just going to pour that oil into here, so as I say, we can then measure how much oil we've taken out of the car. Now, there's a couple of things to note. The reason that the oil pan has still got lots of oil in it, you can see how much higher this here comes than the actual base of the oil pan. In here is a magnet, and the style of magnet in this particular oil pan is different to the later ones. The later ones use a much bigger magnet. The magnets are obviously designed to catch all the sludge and any metal shavings from your engine. So before you put your oil pan back on, make sure you clean all of this out thoroughly. If you are experiencing shift problems, either you're getting stuck in limp mode, or you can't shift out of second, or your car's revving and things like that, and you're convinced that the oil level in your transmission is correct, remember, you need to measure the level of the oil at the correct temperature with the correct dipstick. And you can go to the trouble of taking the valve body off here and replacing the conductor plate, which is this thing down here. And what often happens is that the speed sensors go bad, or possibly the solenoids go bad. That's much less likely. What also happens is that you start to get that metallic particles, a sludge of metallic particles start to wick their way through here and start shorting out these connections. But I don't think we are actually going to go to the rigmarole of changing the conductor plate. It's always a good idea before you fit a new part to compare it with the old part. These two look identical. The only thing to be aware of is that the filter does come with an O-ring, so just make sure the old O-ring comes out with the old filter. The oil filter just pushes straight on. It does have a locating pin. Make sure you get the filter in the correct position, otherwise you will struggle to get the transmission pan over the filter. We're just going to take this little cable clip off here and this metal shield and have a look at the electrical plug up there. We are going to attempt to take that plug out, or at least change the O-rings of it. But before you take it out, just make a careful note of the orientation of it, that hole there where the locating pin is. The way that plug comes out is that you just pull that lever down and that pushes the plug out. This lever pulls all the way to the bottom, at which point this plug should just come out. Now, you're not supposed to see oil dripping out of there, and if you are seeing oil, it's a good indication that the O-rings are starting to fail inside that electrical connection. Once those oil rings start to fail, you'll start to get oil making its way up those connections, and it'll wick its way all the way up that lead to the transmission control module, and the oil has suspended metal particles in it, and if they start shorting out those connections, you will get all sorts of problems with your transmission. This is the new plug fitting here, and it has a 7mm bolt inside it, and one of the mistakes that people make when they're fitting this is they over tighten that nut. You do not need to do that. Once you've undone that, it is just a matter of getting your hand in there and then wiggling this. This is actually quite loose, and once again, just make special note of where that is, because when you put it back in, you do not want to cross the pins. This is the part here, and these O-rings are so loose, and in fact one of them is still in there, so make sure you get the old O-ring out. Now, before you put the new bit in, my advice would be to get some new transmission fluid and just put it on these seals, so that will slip in nice and easily. And obviously make sure this is in the right position and that you've aligned things correctly so that those holes there line up with the pins. Now, the two fittings are slightly different. The old one, the locator, actually sticks out, whereas on the new one it's flush, and that locator there should line up with the piece of metal just there. Now, it is sometimes quite tricky to get these in and out, but at the moment the new one doesn't want to go in, whereas the old one goes in and out really easily. I'm really struggling to get the new fitting in, so rather than risking ruining it and bending the pins, I'm just going to take the O-rings off the new fitting, put them in the old fitting and put the old one back in. Right, we finally got that in. My advice is you've got to be really careful tightening that up. Tighten it up by hand first, and then just give it a 90-degree twist with a socket. Do not get a socket on there straight away, because if you strip those threads, you will be in for a world of pain. The kit doesn't come with a new O-ring for the actual plug. Once again, that's not normally too difficult to get in. You just push it in by hand, and then this should wind it in. Make sure you wind it in all the way so it's nice and snug in there. There's nothing special about putting these bolts back on. Just make sure obviously the clamps are in the right position. Just remember, when you put these bolts in, finger tight first, crisscross pattern, and then when they're all finger tight, you can then get a torque wrench on them at 8 Newton meters. Now, if you were doing the conductor plate, it's the bolts that hold the conductor plate to the valve body are also 8 Newton meters, and they have a 90-degree turn after you've done the 8 Newton meters, but the actual pan bolts are just 8 Newton meters, I believe. So again, I'm carefully going around with the torque wrench, not torquing the bolts yet, but still doing a crisscross pattern. There's no rush with this. You do not want to clamp this unevenly and end up with the oil leak. Once you've finished torquing all of the bolts up, the sump bolt is torqued to 20 Newton meters on the pan that you buy from Euro. That's actually pre-torqued by the looks of it. Next up, we're just going to bolt this bracket on. There's no torque specs for those bolts, and then we'll put this bracket on across here. Once you've got this bracket on, we can start putting on the drip plates here. We'll just give them a wipe first, get rid of any old oil. Wow, the mystery of the missing lock pin. This is the lock pin here for the oil dipstick tube, which I dropped ages ago. If you do ever drop yours, it'll end up in this piece of plastic trim here. When you're putting these plates back on, remember not to put these two screws in because the front plate screws to that. So you put the middle ones in, the back ones, and then these two here, leaving those two out. Wow, so only 2 litres of oil have actually come into our catch pan here, which is a lot less than expected. I suspect that's because of the oil leak. So we've put in 2 litres of oil, and we're just going to fire this car up. We'll test it on the gear dipstick first, but the lower mark on the dipstick is at 25 degrees and it's significantly colder than that now. So we'll just test it with the dipstick first, but then once you've done this oil change, you need to go through the gears, leave each gear reverse, park, drive, etc. for 5 seconds just to get the oil flowing between all the solenoids. What we're going to do now is just put the car in gear for 5 seconds and into neutral. Just do that a couple of times. Make sure you've got your foot on the brake when you do that, obviously. The only way you can accurately check the level of oil is with a scanner going into the transmission control unit and then going into special functions and then test the oil actual values check. And when you check the temperature of the oil, you can see that that reads 84 degrees, but if you don't put the car in drive or reverse when reading the level, you'll get an incorrect reading. When you put it in drive, you can see that drops to 53 degrees. So either drive or reverse is essential. If you don't do that and you measure the level of the oil, you'll get an incorrect reading on the dipstick and put the wrong amount of oil in the car. Now, ideally, after you've filled the car up with oil, what you would do is run the engine and then you'd put the car back on the ramp, lift it up and check for any leaks. But as I'm calling in a favour from Auto Classico and I know they're very busy, I'm going to assume that I got it right the first time, and we're just going to take the car out of the garage and get the oil up to temperature and test it on the dipstick. You can see with the oil temperature 80 degrees, we're about 250 mil to 300 mil short of oil, I would say. The oil is now at 80 degrees and we've topped that up to the correct level. We took out just over 2 litres and put back in just over 3 litres. Now we have had a bit of a transmission leak, so that probably accounts for that difference, and hopefully that leak will be fixed now. You're going to need about 4 litres of transmission fluid to change the filter. We're using this Febby part number 29449. We got our transmission fluid off eBay from these guys here, Sussex Autos, paid £47.16 for 4 litres delivered. We bought the transmission dipsticks some time ago. That cost us just over £5, and there is a video all about that already on the channel. You'll pay just under £50 for a transmission flush kit off eBay. That includes the rubber gasket, the filter itself, the red security tab that you need to snap off the dipstick covering, the pass-through connector, which includes the 2 O-rings. You'll get a new set of stretch bolts and also a new sump plug and washer. Well, it's the next day and I'm happy to say that our garage floor is not covered with transmission oil, so I think we can call that job done. In the next video, I'm going to be changing the engine oil on this car and replacing all of those rusty fittings with stainless steel ones.